Las Vegas, Nevada, January 14th, 1964, 12:33 a.m. The Copa Room corridor at the Sands Hotel was 12 feet wide. It ran between the service entrance of the Copa Room and the network of backstage corridors that connected the performance spaces to the dressing rooms and the management offices and the hotel proper. It had the specific atmosphere of a corridor that existed for function rather than presentation. Plain walls, institutional lighting, the working interior of an entertainment establishment that put its resources into what the audience saw rather than what the performers walked through. Dean Martin was in this corridor because the fastest way to the parking area from the Copa Room stage passed through it. He was alone. Phil Barker had gone ahead to deal with a car issue. The evening had been the second show, the late show, the one that ran to 11:30, and Dean was in the specific physical and mental state that followed a late show, which was the state of someone who has given what they came to give and is now in the process of becoming the person who did not have to give anything for a while. He was wearing the dark charcoal tuxedo jacket with the black bow tie loosened and the white formal dress shirt, and he had a glass of something amber in his left hand, the drink that traveled with him from the stage to the corridor, the way it traveled from segment to segment on the television show, simply present, part of the presentation of someone for whom ease was not performed but constituted. He heard the footsteps behind him. He did not turn immediately. Footsteps in a backstage corridor were not a signal. They were the ordinary traffic of a working entertainment venue at 12:30 in the morning. Then the footsteps stopped, directly behind him. He turned. Vincent Scolari was 6 feet 3 inches tall. He weighed 240 pounds, none of it unnecessary. He had been working in personal security in Las Vegas since 1957 and had been specifically with Frank Sinatra since 1961, which meant he had spent 3 years developing the specific professional identity of someone who stood near the most powerful man in entertainment and whose physical presence was, by design, a communication. The communication was, this man is protected. Everything around this man exists under a specific understanding about consequences. He was wearing a dark suit and a white shirt and a dark tie, and his posture communicated what his posture always communicated, which was that he occupied space with intent and that the intent had weight behind it. He said, "Mr. Martin." Dean said, "Yes." Scolari said, "Mr. Sinatra would like you to know that what you said to Eddie Whitman on Thursday was not what he expected from you." He said it in the flat professional tone of someone delivering a message that has the sender's full authority behind it. There was a silence. Not the silence of Dean Martin processing the information. The silence of Dean Martin looking at Vincent Scolari. 6 seconds. Dean picked up his drink. He said, "Tell Frank I'll call him tonight." He turned and walked down the corridor toward the parking area. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button, because what happened in those 6 seconds and what the phone call that followed contained and what Vincent Scolari did when he reported back to Frank Sinatra about those 6 seconds is one of the true stories about what loyalty actually looks like between two people who have built something together across 20 years. Stay, now, back to the corridor. Dean Martin has just walked away from Frank Sinatra's Bodyguard, and the call is coming. What Dean Martin had said to Eddie Whitman on Thursday was this. He had said, at a dinner table at the Desert Inn, in the course of a conversation about the coming year's performance schedule, "Frank has got more opinions than he has got patience for other people's." He had said it with the flat, amused certainty of someone stating a fact about a person they know well, the specific kind of observation that is only available to someone who is close enough to be accurate about the shortcomings of the person they are describing. Eddie Whitman was a music industry lawyer with fingers in several of the Sands Hotel contractual arrangements. He collected information the way people in his position collected information, selectively, with an ear for what was useful. What Eddie Whitman told the person he told was this. Dean Martin said Frank Sinatra is hard to work with and does not listen to anyone. What that person told the next person was different again. By the time the sentence arrived at Frank Sinatra, it had traveled through 4 intermediaries across 4 days and had become, Dean Martin is telling people in Las Vegas that Frank Sinatra is a problem. Frank Sinatra, who valued loyalty with the specific intensity of someone who had built everything he had on the foundation of people being with him or against him, had heard this and had not called Dean directly. He had sent Scolari. This was not unusual. Frank sometimes communicated through intermediaries on matters of displeasure. The intermediary carried the displeasure, and the displeasure's recipient understood that the intermediary was the signal, that the deployment of someone like Vincent Scolari meant the matter was serious, and that the weight of Frank Sinatra's disapproval was communicated by the choice of messenger. Dean understood this architecture. He had been inside it for many years. He also understood something that Scolari could not have understood, which was that whatever Frank had heard about Thursday's dinner was not what had been said at Thursday's dinner, because what had been said was something Dean would have said to Frank's face, and had said to Frank's face on similar occasions without Frank objecting. The specific kind of observation Dean had made was the kind of observation that existed inside their friendship rather than outside it. He said, "Tell Frank I'll call him tonight." He did not say this to manage Vincent Scolari. He said it because it was the accurate description of what was going to happen next. He called Frank at 1:15 in the morning. Frank Sinatra answered on the second ring. Dean said, "It's me." Frank said, "I heard." Dean said, "What did you hear?" Frank said, "That you have been talking to people." Dean said, "I talk to people every night. I'm in the talking business." Frank said, "You know what I mean." Dean said, "I know what you think I mean." There was a pause. Dean said, "What did I say exactly, according to who you heard from?" Frank said, "That I was difficult." Dean said, "Who isn't?" Frank said, "Dean." Dean said, "Frank, what I said to Eddie Whitman on Thursday was that you have more opinions than you have patience for other people's. That is what I said." There was a pause. Frank said, "That is not what I heard." Dean said, "No, I know it is not, and I know how it got from what I said to what you heard." Frank said, "How?" Dean said, "The same way everything gets from what someone says to what you hear. It passes through people who have an interest in it sounding a specific way when it arrives." Another pause. Frank said, "And what I heard, is it true? What you actually said?" Dean said, "Yes." Silence. Dean said, "You do have more opinions than you have patience for other people's. That is not an insult, Frank. It is why you built everything you built. People who have patience for other people's opinions do not make what you have made." Frank was quiet. Dean said, "You sent Scolari?" Frank said, "Yes." Dean said, "You could have called me." Frank said, "I know." Dean said, "That is the thing I want you to think about, not what I said to Eddie Whitman. The fact that you did not call me. You sent Scolari to stand in a corridor." There was a long pause. Frank said, "I was angry." Dean said, "I know you were angry. When you are angry, you send intermediaries. When I am angry, I disappear. We have known each other for 20 years. We know how each other works." Frank was quiet. Dean said, "You should have called me." Frank said, "You are right." He said it without the performance of admission. He said it the way he said things when he had been brought to an accurate accounting of something and was acknowledging the accounting. Dean said, "Tell Scolari to stand down." Frank said, "He was not doing anything." Dean said, "He was doing the thing he does just by being in a corridor, Frank." Frank said, "I know." He said, "I will talk to him." Dean said, "Good." There was a pause. Frank said, "What you said about the opinions, you have said the same thing to me directly." Dean said, "Yes." Frank said, "And I have never had a problem with it." Dean said, "No." Frank said, "So, When I heard someone else say it, Dean said, you assumed it meant something different coming from someone else's mouth. Frank said, yes. Dean said, it meant the same thing. Frank was quiet. He said, come by tomorrow, afternoon, 3. Dean said, I will be there at 3. Frank said, Dean, do not say things about me to Eddie Whitman. Dean said, noted. Frank said, or anyone else. Dean said, Frank, I have been saying things about you to people for 20 years. Most of them were compliments. Frank said, I know that. He said, 3 o'clock. Dean said, 3 o'clock. The call lasted 22 minutes. Vincent Scolari reported back to Frank Sinatra at 1:40 in the morning. He described the corridor encounter in the flat professional way of someone who had made an assessment and was delivering it accurately. He said to tell you he would call. He had a drink. He walked away. Frank said, 6 seconds. Scolari said, about that. Frank said, what was in his face? Scolari thought about this carefully. He said, nothing. Frank said, angry? Scolari said, no. Frank said, scared? Scolari looked at him. He said, no, Mr. Sinatra. Frank said, what then? Scolari said, he looked at me the way you look at something you already knew was coming, and that does not require a reaction. And then he said what he said. Frank said, what did he say? Scolari said, tell Frank I will call him tonight. Frank was quiet. Frank said, how long did he look at you before he said it? Scolari said, 6 seconds, maybe. Frank was quiet. Scolari said, should I do anything else? Frank said, no, go home. He turned to leave. Frank said, Scolari. Scolari turned back. Frank said, next time I want to communicate something to Dean Martin, call me before you do anything. Scolari said, yes, sir. Frank said, I mean it. Scolari said, yes, sir. He left. Frank Sinatra sat in his suite at the Sands Hotel at 1:40 in the morning and thought about 6 seconds. Not about what Dean had said to Eddie Whitman. Not about the corridor. About 6 seconds of a man looking at someone Frank had sent to communicate displeasure and producing in his face the specific expression of someone who is not going to be intimidated and who is not going to make a thing of not being intimidated. Just looking, and then 5 words, and then the drink, and then the walk down the corridor. Frank had known Dean Martin for 20 years. He knew that expression. He had seen it in rooms across 20 years. The specific expression of Dean Martin not reacting, which was not the same as Dean Martin not feeling. It was the face of a man who had decided that the thing in front of him did not require him to produce a reaction, and who was right, and who was communicating that correctness without words and without confrontation. Frank thought, I should have called him. He picked up the phone and dialed. Dean answered. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of January 15th, 1964, Dean Martin went to Frank Sinatra's suite at the Sands Hotel. Phil Barker noted this in his notebook, without noting the reason. Phil had learned across 19 years that some things were noted as facts, and some things required annotation, and some things required neither, because the fact was sufficient and the annotation would be wrong. Dean and Frank were in the suite for 45 minutes. No one else was present. No one knows precisely what was said in those 45 minutes. What is known is that the 45 minutes achieved what 22 minutes on the phone had not completely achieved, which was the specific full repair of something between two people who had built something together and who both understood that what they had built was more important than whatever had temporarily come between them. Frank Sinatra continued to use personal intermediaries for various matters of his professional life across the years that followed. He never again sent an intermediary to deliver a message to Dean Martin. When he had something to say to Dean, he said it to Dean. This was, in Frank Sinatra's operational world, a significant adjustment. It was the kind of adjustment that did not announce itself. It was simply present in what Frank Sinatra did and did not do in the years that followed January of 1964. Dean Martin had brought it about in 6 seconds. Vincent Scolari worked for Frank Sinatra until 1971. In a 1971 interview with Las Vegas entertainment journalist Gloria Hart, he was asked about his years with Frank Sinatra and what he had learned. He said, "I learned to read rooms. That is the whole job. You read the room and you read the people in it, and you make the correct assessment and you act on the assessment." The journalist asked if there was ever a time he made the wrong assessment. Scolari said, "January of 1964. I was sent to deliver a message to Dean Martin." He described the corridor. He said, "I went in reading the situation as one where my presence alone would communicate what needed to be communicated. Most situations work that way. A large man in a corridor late at night carries information without saying anything." The journalist said, "And with Dean Martin?" Scolari said, "He turned around and he looked at me, not up at me, and in 6 seconds I understood that I had made an error. I had assessed him as someone who would respond to the kind of situation I usually created. He did not respond to it at all. He looked at me the way you look at weather, something that exists but that does not require you to do anything." He said, and then he said 5 words, picked up his drink, and walked down the corridor. He said, "I stood there for about 30 seconds after he was gone." The journalist said, "What were you thinking?" Scolari said, "I was thinking that Mr. Sinatra was going to get a call that night, and that the call was going to be harder on Mr. Sinatra than anything I could have produced in a corridor." He paused. He said, "Which is exactly what happened." He said, "That was the only time I went to do a job and immediately understood that the job was unnecessary, because the person I was sent to deal with was not the kind of person that job worked on." The journalist said, "What kind of person was he?" Scolari thought for a long time. He said, "The kind who did not need to win the corridor. He knew the corridor was the wrong place for this to happen, and he left it in the corridor, and he went to where the right place was, which was directly between him and Frank Sinatra." He said, "He made the corridor irrelevant." He said, "In 6 seconds." He said, "I have been in situations with a lot of people in this business across a lot of years. That was the only time I went to create a situation, and the person I was creating it for was simply not available for the situation. Not angry, not scared, simply somewhere else already. Already at the phone call, already at Frank Sinatra's door the next afternoon. The corridor was not real to him because he already knew what was real." He looked at the journalist. He said, "I have thought about those 6 seconds for a long time. What was in them?" He said, "What was in them was 20 years. 20 years of knowing Frank Sinatra well enough to know that this was not about a corridor. This was about a phone call between 2 men who had known each other for 20 years and who were going to settle it between themselves. No corridor was going to change that or be relevant to that." He said, "He just did not pick up the corridor. He walked away from it and walked toward the phone. He was quiet." He said, "That is the whole 6 seconds." Phil Barker's notebook entry from January 14th, 1964 contains 1 line. It says, "Corridor, vs. DM, 6 sec, TFICD-CHT." TFICD-CHT was Phil Barker's shorthand for 5 words. "Tell Frank I will call him tonight." 5 words. Then a drink. Then the walk down the corridor. Then the call at 1:15. Then, at 3 o'clock the following afternoon, Frank Sinatra's door. Frank Sinatra never sent an intermediary to Dean Martin again. Dean Martin never mentioned the corridor to Frank Sinatra. Not at 3 o'clock that afternoon, not in the years after. Because the corridor was not worth mentioning. Because the corridor was the wrong place for what needed to happen between them. And they both knew that. And they had known it for 20 years. And that is what 20 years of knowing someone looks like when it is real. That is the whole confrontation. That is the whole 6 seconds. That is still the whole of it. There is one final piece of this accounting that belongs here. Gloria Hart, the journalist who interviewed Vincent Scolari in 1971, kept her interview notes. She had interviewed many people connected to the Las Vegas entertainment world across 15 years of covering it, and she kept her notes the way journalists of her generation kept notes, in spiral notebooks organized by date and subject, in the specific archival practice of someone who understood that what seemed minor at the time of the interview might prove significant later. She did not publish the full Scolari interview in 1971. She published 3 paragraphs of it in a longer piece about security in Las Vegas entertainment. The 3 paragraphs did not include the 6 seconds. They did not include the 5 words. She kept the full notes. In 1988, she was asked by a researcher compiling a study of Las Vegas entertainment culture to share her interview archive for that period. She agreed. The researcher read the full Scolari interview. He read the 6 seconds. He read the 5 words. He read Scolari's description of Dean Martin in the corridor, the man who looked at weather, who was already somewhere else, who made the corridor irrelevant by simply not inhabiting it the way Scolari had constructed it. He wrote a paragraph about it in his study. The paragraph said, "What the Scolari account describes is the specific quality of someone who understands the difference between the surface of a confrontation and what is actually being confronted." Scolari created a surface confrontation, the large man in the corridor, the physical authority of presence, the weight of the sender's reputation. Martin understood that the surface confrontation was not the real confrontation. The real confrontation was between him and Sinatra. He responded to the real confrontation, not the surface one, and in doing so made the surface one irrelevant. He said, "This is not a small thing. Most people respond to the surface of a confrontation because the surface is what is in front of them, and because the surface is designed to require a response. To look at the surface and see through it to what is actually happening requires both clarity about what matters and composure sufficient to not be captured by what is designed to capture." He said, Dean Martin had both. He said, in 6 seconds he declined the surface confrontation and redirected toward the real one, and by morning the real one was resolved. He said, Frank Sinatra never sent an intermediary to Dean Martin again. He said, that outcome is the measure of the 6 seconds. The researcher's study was published in 1991. It was not widely read, but the paragraph about the corridor was accurate, and the corridor was real, and the 6 seconds were real, and the 5 words were real. "Tell Frank I will call him tonight." And Frank was called, and the door was opened at 3 o'clock the next afternoon, and what was between them was repaired, because it was real, and 20 years of what was real did not disappear into a corridor at 12:30 in the morning. It went to a phone, and to a door, and it was still there. That is still the whole of it.